Okay, a quick reminder that you need to make sure that your calculator is in degree mode before you start. So if you did this the last couple of days and put it in degree mode, it should stay that way unless you've had to change the batteries or you reset the memory or something, then it defaults back to radian mode, which will give us all of the wrong answers. So so just double check each time before you get started that it's in degree mode. And I'll try to remind you, but that's important, okay? So let's look at solving for a missing angle. So we've spent the last couple of days looking for missing sides. Now we're going to switch it around and look for angles. So this little part at the top, if you know the sine, cosine, or tangent ratio of an angle, then you can use the inverse of the ratio. And that notation is this -1. That means inverse. So you can find the inverse to find the measure of the angle. So this is going to be a button on our calculator. So if you look, here are sine, cosine, and tangent buttons. Right above it, it says sine to the -1 or the inverse of sine, cosine to the -1 or inverse of cosine, tangent of -1 or the inverse of tangent. So to get that, we hit the second button and then sine. So second sine gets me sine inverse, or second cosine gets me cosine inverse. Okay, so that's where the buttons are on our calculator. So the same sine, cosine, tangent. This time when we're looking for an angle, we just hit second beforehand. Okay, all right, so let's try one. So every time we're using sine, cosine, tangent, we use SOHCAHTOA. I want to look and decide, am I given the opposite, the adjacent, or the hypotenuse? What is given to me? Well, if you remember, I always like to find the hypotenuse first. I think it's the easiest. It's the one we're most familiar with. So here's my hypotenuse. And then is the 15 the opposite or the adjacent? Well, 15 is across, so it's going to be the opposite. So I am given the hypotenuse and the opposite. So does SO, CA, or TOA have an H and an O in it? So does. Has an H and an O in it. So goes with sine. So sine, and I'm just going to set this ratio up like we've done the last couple of days. Next to sine, you always put your angle measure, and in this case, it's X. That's what I'm solving for. And then opposite over hypotenuse. So opposite is 15, hypotenuse is 24. Questions on setting up the ratio before I show you how to do it in the calculator, how to solve it? Okay, so now I'm ready to type it in the calculator. For sine of X, I'm going to use the inverse of sine. And then I keep this ratio, 15 over 24. So type that in your calculator. So inverse of sine, 15 over 24. So second sine, 15 divided by 24. Oh, see, that was wrong because my mode, I didn't check mine. So let me put it in degree mode. And let me try that again. Second sine, 15 over 24. That looks better. On angles, you are going to round to the nearest whole degree. So no decimals. So 38.6. So X is 38.6. And if I round that to the nearest degree, that's going to round up to 39 degrees. So this angle measure in here is 39 degrees. All right, questions on the first one. I'm going to do several more, but questions on that one? Okay, let's try a second one. All right, so I'm going to start with SOHCAHTOA. And let's identify whether we're given the sine, cosine, or tangent. So I always like to look for, not sine, cosine, or tangent, sorry, the opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse. So I always look for hypotenuse first. So this one is hypotenuse. So since it's hypotenuse, I've narrowed it down to either sine or cosine, right? It's not going to be tangent because it doesn't have hypotenuse. And so what is the 8? Is the 8 the opposite or the adjacent? Well, it's next to it, so it's going to be the adjacent, which is going to be K. So questions on how I knew it was cosine? Okay, so I have cosine of my angle measure, which in this case is X, equals adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent is 8, hypotenuse is 11. So questions on the ratio before we type it in? Okay, so to find the inverse, I do cosine to the -1 and then my ratio. So the inverse of cosine for 8 out of 11. So second cosine, 8 over 11. And I get 43.3. So X is 43.3, which rounds to 43 degrees, nearest whole angle. All right, questions on the second one? Okay, let's do a third one. All right, so SOHCAHTOA. Let's identify our sides first. So hypotenuse is over here, but there's not any information over here, so I don't have a hypotenuse, which means it's not going to be SO or K, because both of those involve a hypotenuse, right? So that leaves me with TOA. So this is going to be tangent. So let's just figure out which is the opposite and which is the adjacent. So opposite from X is 20 and adjacent from X is 37. So tangent of X is opposite over adjacent. So questions on that before we type it in? Okay, so let's go to our calculator and we're going to type in the inverse of tangent and then our ratio, 20 over 37. All right, so second tangent, oh, I already forgot, what was it? 20 over 37. And I get 28.3. And for degrees, we're going to round to the nearest degree, so 28. All right, questions on that one? And would anyone like me to do a fourth one? Anybody want to see another one? Actually, I know somebody that just came in, so let's do another one because I just let somebody in. So let's let them see a fourth one or second one for them. So SOHCAHTOA. So am I given the opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse? Well, here's my hypotenuse. And then X is adjacent to the 18. So if I have adjacent and hypotenuse, that goes with K. So this is going to be cosine. You always put your angle measure next, which in this case is X. Adjacent over hypotenuse. So 18 over 23. And so in the calculator, we're going to do the inverse of cosine. and then our ratio. That is a messy 3. So inverse of cosine 18 over 23. So 38.4. So 38.4 would round to 38 degrees. All right, so on your practice in a minute, you're going to have, I think there's 4 or 5 where you're finding angle measures. So you're doing this, you're setting up the ratio and then using the inverse to find the angle. Then at the bottom, it has some review of what we've done the last couple of days. Just moving forward, I'm going to try to mix them so that you get used to finding sides, finding angles, kind of going back and forth because you'll be tested with it mixed together. Okay, so let's just review finding a side. Again, that's what you've done the last couple of days, but let's just get it fresh. So I'm still looking at SOHCAHTOA. This time I'm looking for a side, and I know it's a side because it's outside. I knew these were angles because it was inside the triangle and had that little degree on it. Okay, so you can tell them apart pretty easily. All right, am I given these adjacent, opposite, or hypotenuse? Well, here's my hypotenuse, and nothing's over here, which means it's got to be tangent. I'm going to use the TOA ratio. So I'm going to use tangent of, you always do your angle, so 39 equals, and I want opposite over adjacent. So 11 is my opposite, X is my adjacent. So 11 over X. Okay, if you remember, since X is on the bottom, are you going to multiply or divide these? Does anybody remember from yesterday?
Divide.
Divide, good. So when I cross multiply here, I get X times the tangent of 39 equals 11. And then I'll divide both sides by the tangent. So X equals, and then I'm going to type this in. 11 divided by tangent of 39. So 13.58. And on sides, you're going to round to the nearest tenth. So just like you've been doing. So this will be 13.6. Okay, would anyone like me to do one more side?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at this one. Okay, so SOHCAHTOA. Okay. Do I have opposite, adjacent, or hypotenuse? So here is my hypotenuse. And X then is the adjacent. So if I have the adjacent and the hypotenuse, do I have sine, cosine, or tangent? I have cosine. So the cosine of my angle measure of 46 equals adjacent over hypotenuse, so X over 28. Since X is on top, am I going to multiply or divide? Multiply. So 28 times cosine of 46. So type that in your calculator. 28 times cosine, I already forgot, what was it? 46. So 19.45. Which when we round to the nearest tenth would be 19.5. So sides you round to the nearest tenth, angles you round to the nearest whole degree.